March 3, 1994 was a chilly day in Memphis. Folks were worrying about bills, basketball, and maybe a late winter frost. No one expected a police convoy at Rose Hill Cemetery on Elvis Presley Boulevard. Yet, that morning, detectives got a tip from a young man named Jonathan Montgomery. He told them to bring shovels and courage. Following him through the headstones, Detective Jack Ruby stopped at the grave of Dorothy Daniels. Daniels had been buried less than a week earlier, February 25. Her grave sat just 6 plots from the Montgomery family plot. Ruby looked down and wondered why someone would point them here. What happened next was something out of a Southern Gothic novel. Under court order, the detectives disinterred Daniels's casket. They expected to find one body and some peace for a grieving family. Instead, after prying back a layer of dirt and plywood, they uncovered 3 additional bodies, like a grim stack of Russian dolls. Hidden beneath Daniels's Prestwood vault were Marcello's Cello Anderson, his mother Deloise, and their family friend Frederick Tucker. Someone had lowered them into the hole and then carefully covered them with dirt and a single piece of plywood before placing the casket on top. The way the bodies were arranged tells its own story. According to Dr. Hugh Edward Berryman, one of the forensic anthropologists on scene, there was no sign that Dorothy Daniels's casket had been disturbed after burial. That means the victims had been placed in the grave before Daniels's funeral, which suggests planning, not panic. A cemetery worker testified that a Prestwood box was inserted into Daniels's grave on February 24, the day before her burial. It would have taken at least 2 people to lower that heavy box. Someone prepared that vault in broad daylight while the cemetery was open, which is both bold and morbidly efficient. When investigators removed the bodies, they found Deloise Anderson at the bottom, with Marcello's and Frederick lying on top of her. Their hands were bound behind their backs, and Deloise had a red sock tied around her neck. Frederick's feet were also bound, and his neck showed bruising from a ligature. Marcello's was missing his expensive jewelry, suggesting robbery. The autopsy later revealed that all 3 victims were alive when they were covered with dirt. Deloise suffocated under the weight of her son and friend. Dirt clogged her nose and mouth. Frederick had been shot in the chest, but the wound wasn't fatal. He likely died from the compression of soil and bodies. Marcello's was shot 3 times, 1 bullet severing his spinal cord so he couldn't move. He and the others felt the dirt falling on them. It is a horrifying image, and yet we have to keep telling it, because the details reveal the killer's cruelty. So why were investigators at Rose Hill? And who were these 3 people? Marcello's Anderson was 25, a flashy young man who wore diamond rings, carried rolls of cash and kept money hidden in his mother's attic. He was deeply involved in the Memphis drug trade. His mother, Deloise, was a church-going woman who worried about her son but loved him fiercely. Freddie Tucker was a friend of Marcello's. All 3 trusted Tony Vaughn Carruthers and the Montgomery brothers, James and Jonathan. Marcello's thought Carruthers was a trustworthy friend. That trust would lead them to a grave. Investigators quickly realized that this burial wasn't a spontaneous act. The killers had scouted the cemetery weeks earlier. Tony Carruthers had even told fellow inmates that burying a body at a cemetery would be a good way to hide evidence because, if you ain't got no body, you don't have a case. When he was assigned to work at a veterans cemetery, he learned how to dig graves and handle caskets. In one chilling conversation, he nudged Jonathan Montgomery and hinted that the master plan would happen after James Montgomery's release. On February 24, the day before the bodies were hidden in Daniels's grave, cemetery workers saw a Prestwood vault delivered and lowered into the ground. The killers likely visited the cemetery that day and placed the bodies inside the vault. They covered them with dirt and plywood. The next day, Dorothy Daniels's funeral proceeded as planned. Mourners unknowingly stood over a secret grave. It took 8 days and a guilty conscience to break the silence. Jonathan Montgomery had told friends that, "We got them folks at the cemetery," bragging about taking $200,000 from Marcello's. Maybe the weight of what he'd done became too heavy. Whatever the reason, he led Detective Ruby to the scene. You might imagine the detective's reaction when they found 3 bodies under a coffin. Shock doesn't begin to cover it. Memphis police officers are tough, but even they aren't used to a triple murder hidden beneath a respectable woman's grave. It's one thing to move weight in the drug game, it's another to stage a macabre burial to keep police guessing. It wasn't a horror movie, it was Graceland country, and real families were about to be torn apart. The case would become known as the Rose Hill Cemetery triple murder, and it would haunt Memphis for decades. This prologue also raises a disturbing central question: how does loyalty turn into lethal betrayal? Marcello's invited Tony Carruthers into his home. He drove him around, gave him money and bragged that they were friends. Carruthers repaid that kindness by plotting to rob and kill him. He wrote letters from prison describing a master plan that would be well organized and extremely violent. He was true to his word. He recruited the Montgomery brothers and lured Marcello's, Deloy's and Frederick into a trap. He told them they were going to a party. Instead, he took them to their tomb. All because he believed that with no body there would be no case. And why bury the victims alive? Some say it was to avoid blood evidence and gunshots in the neighborhood. Others think Carruthers wanted to send a message to the drug community: betray me, and you'll suffer a slow, suffocating death. There's also the chilling practicality of burying the bodies under someone else's coffin. The killers assumed no one would ever dig there. They nearly succeeded. There is a dark irony here. A cemetery is a place for rest and respect. It's where families go to mourn and remember. Carruthers and his crew turned it into a crime scene. They used grieving rituals to hide a homicide. They counted on the community's reverence for the dead to shield their secret. But secrets have a way of rising to the surface, especially when guilt eats at an accomplice. Jonathan Montgomery's confession cracked the case open. The discovery at Rose Hill forced detectives to ask who could plan something this elaborate and cruel. The answer led them back to Tony Carruthers, a man who once called Marcello's a friend. As we move through this story, keep asking yourself, what drives someone to bury a living person? Is it greed, fear, ego, or all three? This chapter sets the stage for a saga of betrayal, greed and chilling calculation. The image of three bound bodies hidden beneath a fresh grave will follow us through the investigation, the trials, and the appeals. It serves as a constant reminder that the quest for justice began with a shovel scrape and a detective's gasp. In the next chapter, we'll step back into early 1990s Memphis, where the drug trade thrived and friendships were as fragile as a Prestwood vault. But for now, close your eyes and imagine the quiet of Rose Hill on that March morning. Birds chirp. A light breeze moves the magnolia leaves. Somewhere, under a layer of clay, three souls scream. And a promise is made: someone will answer for this. Chapter 2, Life in Memphis, the Drug Trade and Cello Anderson. Welcome back. We've left the cemetery and stepped back into the streets of Memphis, early 1990s. Picture neon lights flickering on Beale Street, bass thumping out of car speakers, and the sweet smell of barbecue wafting through humid air. But underneath the music and Memphis charm, something darker was brewing. Across America the drug issue had become a top concern. The media told us about cocaine and crack destroying communities, and the government launched campaigns to cut off supply and demand. Cocaine and crack were the #1 challenge facing law enforcement. The Medellin and Cali cartels pumped dope into cities, and Memphis wasn't immune. Dealers drove flashy cars, wore gold chains, and threw parties to rival record labels. Memphis was known for music and soul, but in the early 90s parts of the city turned into open-air drug markets. You could drive down certain streets and see guys leaning against Cadillacs, eyes darting for customers. Crack had hit the neighborhood hard. It was cheap, addictive and profitable. Young men who might have been picking up guitars were picking up pistols. Violence followed the money. If you were in the game, you needed a crew, a car, and a place to stash your cash. The law was trying to fight back. Nationally, President George H.W. Bush announced a comprehensive drug enforcement strategy that partnered federal agencies with local law enforcement, but federal help often arrived late. Many neighborhoods had already been scarred. This is the Memphis that shaped Marcello's Anderson. Known to friends as Cello, he was young, charismatic and ambitious. Cello didn't dream of 9-to-5 employment. He saw older men making fast money in the drug trade and wanted the same. According to court records, he was heavily involved in the drug trade, alongside friends Andre, baby brother, Johnson and Terrell Adair. Cello wore expensive jewelry, including a large diamond ring. He carried large sums of cash on him and kept stacks of money hidden in the attic of his mother's house. Imagine being in your early 20s, walking around with enough money to buy a car tucked into your jacket, and the confidence that everyone knew you had it. It was risky and seductive. Friends say Sello was generous. He loaned money, bought drinks and took people on shopping trips. He liked to flash his success with big rings and a gold chain. In another life, he might have been a rapper or a promoter. In this life, he was a mid-level drug dealer in South Memphis. He moved product, and he moved with swagger. He spent his evenings cruising neighborhoods in a red Jeep, checking on his spots and making sure no one was skimming. He kept a gun nearby because in this business you either carried a weapon or you hoped your friends were faster than your enemies. One of those friends was Tony Vaughn Carruthers. To outsiders, Tony looked like just another guy from the block. He had a natural charm and an easy smile that made people trust him. Sello certainly did. Court testimony shows that Sello considered Carruthers a trustworthy friend. When Carruthers got out of prison in November 1993, Sello picked him up and even gave him $200 to get back on his feet. They hung out together, rode around, and talked about money. To Sello, Tony was like a brother, someone who had his back. Tony, however, saw things differently. While he was still in prison, he wrote letters outlining what he called a master plan that would be well organized and extremely violent. He told fellow inmates that he planned to make those streets pay me, meaning he would take what he wanted from other dealers. Even more chilling, he bragged that burying bodies would be a good way to hide a murder because, if you ain't got no body, you don't have a case. To him, the drug game wasn't about camaraderie, it was about cash and control. Meanwhile, Sello's life was taking off. He bought new clothes, shoes and some fancy electronics. He moved his mom, Deloise, to a modest home and hid his money in her attic. He threw parties that drew people from all over, including other dealers. Andre, baby brother, Johnson and Terrell Adair were his close partners. Their network of buyers and sellers made them comfortable, but it also made them targets. People in the neighborhood knew who had money. Sello and his crew would be traveling around with pockets full of cash, word travels fast on the street. In December 1993, Carruthers was riding around with Jimmy Mays and others when they passed a drive-by shooting in front of Deloise Anderson's home. Tony nudged Jonathan Montgomery and whispered that it would be the perfect time to kidnap Marcellos. He was already plotting to rob his so-called friend. The early 90s drug trade wasn't just about money, it was about status. When Sello showed off his jewelry, he was signaling that he had power. In neighborhoods starved for opportunity, such displays can feel like victory. But they also breed envy. Sello's mother told people she worried about her son's choices, but he kept telling her he was going to make it big and take care of her. He hid his cash in her attic because he trusted that no one would search a mother's house. It's tragically poetic, the very place he used to protect his money became the setting for his funeral planning. Andre, baby brother, Johnson and Terrell Adair also played big roles in the local scene. They were part of Sello's inner circle. They drank together, laughed together and moved product together. But like any partnership in the drug game, alliances were only as strong as the next payday. As the money piles grew, so did suspicion. People whispered that someone was skimming. Others said the police were watching. There was a growing sense that something was about to go down. Jimmy Mays warned Sello and Johnson that Carruthers and the Montgomery brothers planned to get them. Sello shrugged it off. He thought he could handle whatever came his way. After all, he trusted Tony. And why wouldn't he? Tony had eaten at his table, held his nephew, and accepted his generosity. In a different part of town, law enforcement was trying to keep up. National programs were focusing on kingpins and trying to disrupt the chemical supply lines of large cartels, but small-time dealers in Memphis still thrived. Neighborhood networks allowed them to tap into bigger distributors. There were codes, safe houses and lookouts posted on corners. The vibe was dangerous but oddly communal. Men would stand outside all day, leaning on cars, passing weed and information. Kids on bikes served as couriers, whistling when police rolled by. Everyone knew someone who had been shot or robbed. Still, there was a strange sense of optimism. If you could survive the game, you could live like a king. For Sello, the dream was within reach. He had money, respect, and a network. He was also flirting with something bigger. He wanted to expand his territory and maybe get into other business ventures. People said he talked about buying property or investing in a nightclub. He was thinking beyond the street. In December 1993, Tony and the Montgomery brothers started hinting that something big was coming. They asked about the money Sello kept in his mother's attic. They asked about his routines. They were setting him up. What Sello didn't know was that Tony had been telling fellow inmates he would rob him as soon as he was released. Tony even accepted a ride from Sello to leave prison and then immediately started planning his betrayal. The relationship between Tony Carruthers and Marcellos Anderson is one of the most heartbreaking aspects of this story. It underscores how, in the drug trade, friendships can be paper-thin. Tony smiled in Sello's face while plotting his demise. He took gifts and rides from him while writing letters about a violent master plan. He listened to Sello talk about the future while thinking about burying him. That duplicity shows just how corrosive greed can be. It also reveals the tragedy of trust misplaced. Sello, for all his faults, believed in loyalty. Tony believed in opportunity. As we leave this chapter, picture early 90s Memphis, the cracked streets, the booming blues clubs and the flicker of streetlights over deals gone down. Imagine Sello Anderson rolling past in his Jeep, music blasting, jewelry catching the light. He thinks he's invincible. He has cash stashed in the attic and a circle of friends who cheer when he buys another round. Little does he know that one of those friends is already mapping out his grave. In the next chapter, we'll follow the crew as they gather and the tension builds toward the fateful night. Remember, in a world where the drug trade thrives, trust can be the most dangerous substance of all. Chapter 3, Tony Vaughn Carruthers, Master Plan and Prison Letters. Time to meet the man at the center of our story, Tony Vaughn Carruthers. Tony grew up in Memphis, the oldest of 4 kids, and learned to hustle young. Tough streets taught him survival, but they also led him to trouble. Before the events at Rose Hill Cemetery, he was serving time for aggravated assault. In his world, prison wasn't unusual, more like a revolving door that breeds desperation and cunning. Tony's sister later testified that he grew up in one of Memphis's worst housing projects and carried a lot of responsibility as the oldest son. Their father wasn't around, and their mother raised 4 kids on her own. Tony took on the man of the household role, which gave him a sense of duty but also a hot temper. Friends and family remembered him as smart and resourceful. He could be charming and even generous, and many believed he had the potential to do good things. But the same streets that taught him to survive also offered shortcuts that looked like opportunity. His conviction for aggravated assault cemented his reputation as someone willing to use violence. The early 1990s in Memphis were defined by both gospel and grit. Drugs flooded the city, and across America cocaine and crack had become the #1 challenge for law enforcement. News anchors went from reporting the weather to reporting the latest busts. Parents warned their kids about street corners, pastors preached about temptation from the pulpit. For a young man like Tony, the line between legitimate hustle and illegal grind blurred. When you're surrounded by poverty, it can seem like everyone is hustling something: bologna sandwiches, knockoff sneakers or, in Tony's crowd, illegal substances. The economy of the streets was booming, and Tony saw it as both a threat and an opportunity. In 1993 there were more crack rocks than sidewalk cracks, and the lure of fast money proved stronger than any after-school special. It wasn't just the drugs that shaped him, it was the idea that if you were sharp enough you could outsmart anyone. Friends joked that Tony would have made a great businessman if his products had been legal. He kept mental ledgers, remembered who owed him, and never missed a chance to turn a profit. He treated his street schemes like business plans, complete with projections, partnerships, and risk assessments. When the neighborhood whispered about someone making good money, He listened like a CEO studying a market report. In his world, loyalty was currency and betrayal was an occupational hazard. That attitude made him both charismatic and dangerous. Before we dive into the letters, picture Tony in his cell at the Memphis reception center, pen in hand, scribbling away like a mad scientist with a notebook. Except he wasn't dreaming up a cure for anything, he was drafting a script for crime. The master plan letters weren't flowery love notes or journal entries about feelings. They were more like a crime manifesto. He bragged about making the streets pay him back and promised that his future actions would be well-organized and extremely violent. If bullet journaling had been a thing back then, Tony's bullet points would have been actual bullets. He wrote with confidence, almost pride, like he was about to launch a startup. And in a twisted way he was, except the startup capital would come from robbery, and the market he targeted was fellow drug dealers. Tony's prison life also became a networking opportunity. Instead of LinkedIn, he had the prison yard. That's where he met James and Jonathan Montgomery, two brothers with reputations for toughness. Their conversations weren't about hobbies or favorite movies, they revolved around who had money and how to take it. Tony told them that Cello Anderson and his friend, baby brother, Johnson had piles of cash from selling drugs. Together they fantasized about robbing them once they got out. Their alliance was like forming a startup with co-founders who had a shared vision, except their mission statement was, get rich or die trying. In prison, where boredom is plentiful and trust is scarce, these conversations gave them something to look forward to. While on a work detail at the West Tennessee Veterans Cemetery, Tony mixed labor with planning. As he helped bury a body, he told fellow inmate Charles Ray Smith that hiding a body in a grave would make a murder hard to solve because, if you ain't got no body, you don't have a case. To him, it was simple math, no corpse, no conviction. These discussions happened while Tony was still behind bars. Prison didn't slow him down, it gave him time to recruit and plan. He even boasted to Mays that his scheme was a winner. When Tony was released on November 15, 1993, he reunited with Cello, accepted a ride and $200, and continued to act like a friend while plotting his betrayal. Did Tony feel any guilt? He told his sister later that he never planned to do wrong, but his letters show no hesitation. They read like instructions. He wrote about being organized and violent. He plotted quietly, keeping his circle tight while smiling at Cello. Each time Cello bragged about his money or showed off his jewelry, Tony filed it away as intel for his scheme. Not long before the murders, Jimmy Mays warned Cello and baby brother Johnson that Tony and the Montgomerys were plotting against them. Cello ignored the warning. After all, Tony was someone he trusted and had helped. Tony's ability to mask his true intentions was, in the end, his most lethal skill. His letters, comments and prison alliances planted the seeds for the murders. The master plan, letters, the idea of burying bodies, and the pact with the Montgomery brothers all converged. When he said he'd make the streets pay him, he meant robbery and murder. His no body, no case comment became his blueprint. Our story now has its antagonist, a man who treated prison like a planning session and viewed burial as a loophole. In the next chapter, Tony and his crew step out of jail and put the plan into action. Sometimes the most dangerous threats are the ones that smile and shake your hand. Chapter 4, Gathering the Crew, the Montgomery Brothers and Pre-Crime Tension. Every plan needs accomplices, and Tony Carruthers didn't have to look far. In the mid-1990s Memphis street scene there was no shortage of tough characters, but two names would come to define the next act: James and Jonathan Montgomery. Jonathan, Lulu, Montgomery may sound harmless, but he was anything but. He and his older brother James grew up in the same neighborhoods as Tony, with the same exposure to hustle culture and violence. When they crossed paths behind bars, a grim partnership was born. According to court records, Jonathan, Lulu, Montgomery, James's brother, was at the scene of a drive-by shooting and later hopped into a car with Tony, proof that these men moved in the same circles long before the murders. In prison the brothers and Tony bonded over their shared ambitions. Charles Ray Smith, a fellow inmate, overheard Tony telling James that Marcello's Anderson and baby brother, Johnson, were flush with drug money. Tony claimed they could rob and get Anderson and Johnson once they were released. It was like listening to a startup pitch in the wrong setting. The product was violence, the market was their old neighborhood, and the mission statement was to take what others had earned. Tony saw James and Jonathan as partners who could help him carry out his master plan. The trio talked logistics and targets the way some folks talk sports scores, believing that together they could outmuscle rivals and cash in. James was the first of the Montgomery brothers to step back onto the streets. On January 11, 1994, he walked out of prison. Instead of laying low, he confronted Andre, baby brother, Johnson, and declared that he was reclaiming the neighborhood. "It was my neighborhood before I left, and now I'm back and it's my neighborhood again," he said. He even asked Johnson if he wanted to go to war about this neighborhood. When Johnson declined, James escalated the bravado, warning that he felt like he was about to blow Johnson's brains out. Not exactly the neighborly welcome home you expect when someone returns from prison. His threats revealed he wanted to assert dominance, and word of his outburst spread quickly. The tension only grew after that declaration. Near the end of January or early February, Johnson and Terrell Adair spotted James and Jonathan sitting with Carruthers in a gray car down the street. When they approached, James asked why they thought he was trying to harm them and claimed they already had their man staked out. The reassurance came with a threat: if they wanted trouble, the crew could kill their whole family. Carruthers backed him up, saying they would deal with any problems later. Johnson and Adair walked away, thinking the bravado would blow over. It was only a glimpse of what was brewing. Back inside the prison walls, Tony had already laid the groundwork for their scheme. Months earlier, he told Montgomery that Anderson and Johnson dealt drugs and kept a lot of money. He boasted they could rob them when they were released. He also believed that if the police couldn't find bodies, they wouldn't have a case. During the confrontation with Johnson and Adair, James echoed that sentiment. Their plan was to take the demands, money and drugs, and ensure there were no bodies. Tony had earlier told another inmate that burying a body would keep detectives in the dark because, if you ain't got no body, you don't have a case, and James clearly agreed. Evidence shows that the crew didn't sit idle while waiting for James to get out. In mid-December 1993, Mays, his brother, and Tony were riding through Memphis when they saw Terrell Adair's red Jeep in front of Deloise Anderson's house after a drive-by shooting. Jonathan "Lulu" Montgomery climbed into the back seat with Tony. Tony whispered that it would be the best time to kidnap Marcello's, and Jonathan asked which one, baby brother or Marcello's. Tony said it would happen after James was released. 2 weeks later, Mays saw Tony loading antifreeze containers filled with gasoline into a car, a sign that fire might be used to destroy evidence. Despite these warning signs, Anderson and Johnson continued living as if nothing was amiss. Part of the reason might be that Tony had cultivated their trust. Anderson considered Tony a friend and had even given him $200 and a ride when Tony was released in November. So when another inmate, Smith, got out of prison on December 15, 1993 and warned Anderson and Johnson about Carruthers and Montgomery's plans to get them, they didn't take it seriously. They dismissed the warning and continued to trust Tony. When James finally re-entered the neighborhood, the takeover began. He and Tony didn't lurk in the shadows, they announced their intentions. James's confrontation with Johnson, complete with references to war and blowing brains out, demonstrated that he relished his reputation. Carruthers played the good cop by assuring them they were safe for now, but his words confirmed they had already chosen a target and would eliminate anyone who interfered. In the weeks before the kidnappings, they were seen lurking late at night, filling gas cans and whispering about kidnappings. Jonathan even bragged to friends about getting cello and them and stealing money. The bravado stayed hidden from law enforcement, feeding Tony's belief that without bodies there would be no case. These early months of 1994 felt like a slow-motion car crash. Everyone around them heard the screeching tires, Mays, Smith, Johnson, and Adair, but the men at the center kept going. They were blinded by loyalty, pride or just the belief that nothing bad could happen. But Tony, James and Jonathan had already drawn up the blueprint, and no one could say they hadn't warned their victims. Looking back, the signs seem obvious: threats, warnings, midnight meetings and gas cans. Yet Anderson and Johnson kept living the high-roller life, wearing jewelry and carrying cash and trusting Tony. A different ending was possible, but the stage was set. Next comes the day everything went wrong.